in the way that is needed. And hopefully you're getting a sense of how amazing it must have been just to be around the Buddha and to be in contact with the Buddha in that way. How amazing that the Buddha must have been. And maybe a little bit of sadness about, oh, what a shame that we aren't alive at that time when the Buddha is alive. We're alive 2,500 years later. But how amazing that must have been to be alive at the time of the Buddha. So we'll come back to Pingiya and his praises a little later in the talk. But I'm going to tell two stories this evening about two disciples of the Buddha and a particular practice that they adopted and the benefits, the effects of that practice. So the first story is a story of Mahanama. And you'll notice I've drawn a map of India. It's not a very particularly good map of India, but I was quite interested earlier. I was thinking about all the stories and where they took place in northern India. It's too small actually to be useful, but I'll talk you through it anyway. So the Buddha was born in Lumbini, around here in northern India. His family lived in Kapilavastu, just to the side. He spent loads of time in Savatthi, up here. He died in Kusinara, over here. He was enlightened at Bodh Gaya, which is just a bit south down here, and his first teaching was at Sarnath here. So a lot of these is all around the River Ganges in the north of India. I just found that really interesting. I'll come back to that map later, just to kind of show where Pingiya lived as well. So yeah, the Buddha kind of wandered all around the north of India, meeting people and talking to them, teaching them, interacting with them. But when it was rainy, he would stay in one place for 3 months. It would rain and rain and rain for 3 months, and it was too muddy and too slippy to walk around, so he just would stay in one place. Often he'd stay at Shravasti, but in this particular time, this particular story, he was staying in his hometown where he'd grown up in Kapilavastu. So surrounded by family, people that he'd grown up with in his hometown. And one of his members of his family was called Mahanama. Mahanama was a cousin of the Buddha. And apparently the elder brother of Aniruddha, if you know the story of Aniruddha, Mahanama was his elder brother and a cousin of the Buddha. He was a merchant. Some stories say he was a politician. He had a house full of kids. He was a parent. So I really liked hearing the stories of Mahanama because I can empathize with him. I have a house full of kids. I'm a parent. But I really like the way that the Buddha took Mahanama seriously. The Buddha, there's lots of stories where the Mahanama goes to see the Buddha and asks him really good questions. And the Buddha makes time for Mahanama, takes him very, very seriously. He praises him very highly, in fact. Mahanama loved the Buddha. He loved being around the Buddha. And this particular time, he'd been sick. Mahanama had been sick. It's the rainy season. Mahanama's been ill. And I don't know what you're like when you're ill, but I kind of retreat into myself when I'm ill. You kind of just, all you can think about is being ill. But Mahanama is starting to recover. He's been ill. He's starting to recover. And he's wanting to know the kind of news, what's the latest news, what's going on. So it was before the days where you'd pick up your phone and kind of, what's the news, what's going on, what have I missed? So he goes out into Kapilavastu, he wanders around and wants to know what's happening. And what he sees is the monks making robes. And he realizes, the Buddha's going to be leaving. It's the end of the rainy season. The Buddha's leaving. And that's the kind of buzz, that's the talk around Kapilavastu. The monks are making robes. It's the end of the rainy season. The Buddha's going to be leaving. So for Mahanama, you can imagine what that must have felt like. He loves the Buddha. The Buddha's been there for 3 months and he's going to leave. And all the kind of followers of the Buddha, the homeless wanderers, are going to leave with the Buddha. But he's a householder. He's got responsibilities. He's got kids. He's got a busy job. He can't leave. He has to stay in Kapilavastu. So he goes to see the Buddha straight away. He just wants to go and see the Buddha. And the Buddha makes time for him straight away, which I really like. The Buddha really seems to value Mahanama, and straight away he goes to see the Buddha and asks this question. And first of all, there's the usual pleasantries and courtesies. He makes offering, he bows, sits to one side, and then he puts his question to the Buddha. And the question he asks the Buddha is, for those of us, well, first of all, he asked the Buddha, is it true? I've seen the monks making robes. Is it true that you're going to be heading off And the Buddha said, yes, that's true. And then he asked this question, he says, for those of us living in dwelling places, by means of which dwelling place should we live? The translation's a bit clunky, but basically what he's asking us, for those of us with a house, where should we live? You're leaving, where should we live? And that seems like quite a weird thing to ask, doesn't it? A quite strange thing to say. He's already got somewhere to live, he's got a house. So what's he talking about? But the Buddha says, excellent question, Mahanama. That is an excellent question. And the reason it's an excellent question is because what they're talking about is the mind. What should Mahanama do with his mind? Where should his mind dwell while the Buddha isn't there? Because while the Buddha's there, he's just dwelling in the company of the Buddha. He's just dwelling with the Buddha, with an enlightened being all the time. But the Buddha's going to leave. So where should his mind dwell? What should he do with his mind? And this is really drawing out and emphasizing a really important Dharma point that, to be honest, more of the time we live in our state of mind than we do in the external world. We kind of create a world for ourselves with our mind, and we dwell in that mental state. We dwell in our mind much more than we're affected by the external environment. So, and the Buddha has said elsewhere, that which we dwell upon, that which the mind dwells upon, that we become. So whatever you put your mind on, that's what you become. It's the law of karma. You spend your mind, you focus your mind on something, and then you cultivate that, you become that. And that's how the metta bhavana works. You dwell on metta, for example, and then your heart cultivates more metta. So this question, where should I live? You're leaving, I know the monks are leaving, where should I dwell? And then the Buddha gives him a practice, and we've got recorded the instructions of that practice, and I'll say more about that a bit later on. But the practice that the Buddha gives to Mahanama is mindfulness of the Buddha, recollecting the Buddha. He said that's where you should dwell. He also gives him 5 other things to dwell on. He says you can dwell on the Sangha and on the Dharma, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, on your own ethical virtues, on your own generosity. And then the final ones might seem a bit strange to us, but he says you can dwell on how the qualities that the devas have, you have those same qualities. Quite a strange thing, but the devas are celestial beings. They live in these kind of divine places. Mahanama lives in a house full of children, busy life. But he says, it's almost like you can dwell in these heavenly realms by dwelling on the qualities of the devas. So the city gives him 6 places to dwell, but the one I want to really focus on this evening is the most important one, dwelling on the Buddha, recollecting on the Buddha. And that's the theme of this evening. So that's the first story. Mahanama gets given this practice by the Buddha. And I'm going to say more about the practice and its benefits and the details of it a bit later on. Okay, and then I want to now tell the second story, or give the second example of the Buddha's disciple. And this is Pingiya, who we heard about right at the beginning of the talk. And Pingiya lived on the banks of the river Godavari, which is quite a long river, so I'm kind of guessing in the middle. I'm kind of putting Pingiya there, but he could have lived anywhere on there, I don't really know, but he's further south than the Buddha. And he's an elderly man. And he has a teacher called Bharvari. And Bharvari has 12 really important disciples of his own, and Pingiya is one of these disciples. There's a backstory to this, but Bharvari wants... Well, it's quite an interesting backstory, I'm going to tell it. I was just reading about it earlier. Bharvari wants to know about head splitting. Apparently someone's put a curse on Bharvari that his head's going to get split open. And the goddess appears to Bharvari and says, you want to go and see the Buddha? He knows about head splitting. He's the man who knows about head splitting. And I think it's a kind of cunning way of getting Pingiya and his friends to go and meet the Buddha. So he says, right, and he says, well, where's he dwelling? He's an awakened being, a Sambuddha. And he's from Kapilavastu, but right now he's dwelling in Savatthi, and that's where you'll find him. And Bharvari's an old man, Pingiya is an old man as well, but he sends Pingiya and the other disciples to go and ask questions to the Buddha. But he says, if he's enlightened, he'll be able to read your mind. Don't say the question, just think them. And if he's enlightened, he'll know what you're thinking. And then ask him about head splitting as well, if you could, while you're there. So that's what they do. They all go off and they meet the Buddha. And the Buddha starts to have a conversation, and his disciples say, well, who's he talking to? But he's read the mind of the disciples of Bharvari and he's answering the questions. And then He's asked about head split, and he says, well, the head is ignorance, and the head is split into pieces by the 5 spiritual faculties. So he gives him the answer about head splitting, but it might not be the answer that Bharvari was expecting to be brought back. So Pingiya basically falls in love with the Buddha in a kind of dharmic way. He's just like, wow, he becomes a disciple of the Buddha. He goes a disciple of Bharvari, and he leaves, he returns a disciple of the Buddha. And you can just tell from the way he talks about the Buddha how much he really feels for the Buddha, his heart response to the Buddha, how much he was taken by the Buddha. That doesn't really describe it, and Pingiya's praises are very, very beautiful. But this encounter takes place where Pingiya returns to the banks of the river Godavari and meets his old teacher, Bharvari. And I'll read it again. Pingiya says, I'll sing you the praises of the way to the beyond. It was described to us by this man exactly as he saw it, but then there's no reason why a man like him should lie. A mammoth of knowledge, completely pure, a man without desire. And then you've heard some of the verses already. There's lots of them, so I'll read some of the verses. He says, this prince, this beam of light, Gautama, was the only one who dissolved the darkness. This man Gautama is a universe of wisdom, a world of understanding, a teacher whose Dharma is the way things are, instant, immediate, visible all around, eroding desire without harmful side effects, with nothing else quite like it anywhere in the world. So he praises the Buddha, and he praises the Buddha's teaching. Some interesting metaphors or ways he uses to describe the Buddha: a prince, a beam of light. He experiences the Buddha like a beam of light that just dissolves all darkness. He experiences the Buddha as a universe of wisdom. That's an interesting way of talking about the Buddha. It's like this vast cosmos of wisdom, a world of understanding. So he's not just talking about the Buddha's physical body here. He's talking about being in the presence of the Buddha is about like being in a world or universe of wisdom and understanding. Quite an unusual way of talking about the Buddha. So Bharvari says to the, you don't get this especially, but sometimes people say, well, perhaps Bharvari is a little bit annoyed by this. He's kind of saying how great his new teacher is. He's dumped Bharvari. He's got a new teacher. And so he says to him, well, Pingiya, if Gautama is as good as you say, if he's all these things, why don't you spend all your time with him? Why don't you spend every moment with Gautama, this universe of wisdom, this world of understanding, this teacher whose Dharma is all the... Why don't you spend all your time with the Buddha? And then Pingiya replies, Brahmin, sir, there is no moment for me, however small, that is spent away from Gautama, from this universe of wisdom, this world of understanding. That's quite a thing to say. He's now hundreds of miles away from where the Buddha is in Shravasti, but he says there's no moment for me that's spent apart from Gautama. That's strange, isn't it? So he says, you see, sir, with constant and careful vigilance, it's possible for me to see him with my mind as clearly as with my eyes, in night as well as day. And since I spend my nights revering him, there is not, to my mind, a single moment spent away from him. So he is describing a practice of, with his mind, he sees the Buddha with his mind as clearly as he sees him with his eyes. All through the day and all through the night. And because he's revering the Buddha all night, is not a single moment that he's apart from the Buddha. So he says more, he says, I cannot now move away from the teaching of Gautama. The powers of confidence and joy, intellect and awareness hold me there. Whichever way this universe of wisdom goes, it draws me with it. Physically, I cannot move like that. My body is decaying, I'm old and weak. But the driving power of purposeful thought propels me with it without break. So Pingiya is describing a similar practice to the practice that the Buddha gave to Mahanama, which is bearing the Buddha in mind, imagining being mindful of the Buddha all the time, But Pingiya is it's not just mindfulness for Pingiya, it's confidence, faith, joy, intellect, awareness, purposeful thought. It's awareness plus like a huge heart response that the Buddha the Pingiya is feeling for the Buddha. So he's like constantly in the presence of the Buddha. That's how powerful his practice is. It's like he's got this constant communion with the Buddha. He's constantly connected to the Buddha without break. Interesting, like it describes not just a universe of wisdom, it's like wherever this universe of wisdom goes, it draws Pingiya with it, it's like a magnet. The Pingiya has got this kind of like, he's locked into the Buddha, you could say, and wherever the Buddha goes, Pingiya is constantly goes with this universe of wisdom. Quite a thing to describe. Yeah. So we've got these two disciples of the Buddha, and they're both practicing what sounds like a similar practice. And we don't know if the Buddha told Pingiya to practice this, but we know that the Buddha told Mahanama to practice this. Mahanama says to the Buddha, "What should I do with my mind?" And the Buddha says, "Practice recollection of the Buddha." And then when Bharari asks Pingiya, "Why aren't you with the Buddha right now?" And Pingiya says, "Well, I am. I'm with the Buddha all the time. All the time I'm with the Buddha because I'm bearing him in mind all the time with faith, with joy, with awareness, with intellect." So that's all well and good. Maybe next what I'll do is I'll just look in a bit more detail at the instructions that the Buddha gave to Mahanama, because we've heard a bit from Pingiya about the quality of his kind of heart response to the Buddha. But the Buddha gave some quite technical details to Mahanama. So let's look at those and look at this practice of recollecting the Buddha, because it was given by the Buddha to Mahanama and we've got it written down, we've got it recorded. So let's hear about this practice. So it's a practice called Buddhanusati. Buddhanusati. Sati is remembering, recollecting. It's also one of the main translations of mindfulness, sati. But it kind of directly means remembering, recollecting, and of the Buddha, Buddhanusati. But sati, it gives you a flavour of what mindfulness really is, actually, because there's all kinds of, I don't want to be too rude, like other ways that mindfulness is described out in the world today. But actually, mindfulness really is about this. What do you put your mind on? Where do you dwell with your mind? Because that's what you become. So what are you going to be mindful of? What are you going to remember all the time? What are you going to recollect? And there's other things you can do. You can be mindful of the breath, anapanusati, and that's the famous practice that we teach and the Buddha taught. There's satipatthanas, the kind of bases of mindfulness, the foundations of mindfulness. But what we're looking at this evening is mindfulness of the Buddha, Buddhanusati. So when Mahanama says, "Where should I dwell with my mind?" And the Buddha says, "Excellent, Mahanama, excellent." It's fitting for you to approach the Buddha and ask this question. And then what he says next is, "One who is aroused to practice is one of conviction, not without conviction. One aroused to practice is one with persistence aroused, not lazy. One aroused to practice is one of established mindfulness, not muddled mindfulness. One who is aroused to practice is centered in concentration, not uncentered. One aroused to practice is discerning, not undiscerning." So I thought it's helpful it's not really an official list, but the Buddha taught it, so it is an official list. So if you want to establish mindfulness, this is a really good list to think about. If you're doing the mindfulness of breathing or mindfulness of Buddha or mindfulness of anything, you've got to really believe what you're doing. You've got to really be behind it. You need to have conviction. You need to be persistent. When your mind wanders off, you need to be persistent with bringing it back. I'm guessing, I want to look further, it made me want to look further into what these translations might be, what Pali terms, and I might come back to you if I find them out. But I'm thinking these might be sati, sampajana, and appamada, the three aspects of mindfulness where you're aware, centered in concentration, concentrate, and your mind, the quality of mind that knows, can discern between the types of thoughts that you're having and whether they're distractions or not distractions. So you need to create 5 qualities before you consider trying to be mindful of anything. You need to prepare your mind to be able to be mindful. So I thought this was a helpful list just for people who like lists. You can have a look at that. Also, people like meditation or being mindful, that's it. Have a look at that as well. And then, I'll come back to that. So then he says to Mahanama that you should recollect the Buddha. And what he gives to Mahanama is a set of verses to think about, a set of kind of descriptions of the Buddha to bear in mind, to think about. And they're the same verses that have come down to us in the chant called the Tiratna Vandana. A lot of you will know. There's a description of the Buddha, of the Dharma, of the Sangha. And they're the verses that the Buddha gives to Mahanama and says, recollect me in this way. I'm not going to read those out now. You can have a look in the Puja book if you want to see those ways of recollecting the Buddha. And I think for me, they don't do a lot for me. I don't know about you, but I think the translation is a bit clunky of some of them. So what I want to do is just explore, or just to name really, there's lots of different ways that you can dwell on the Buddha and bring the Buddha to mind. And after the tea break, I'm going to lead through a Bodhinaga where I'll just give one example of a way that you could meditate with a Buddha and bring the Buddha to mind. Yeah, but I think what's really important is if you're bringing the Buddha to mind, whether it's in meditation or, well, actually, what he says to Mahanama, he says you should develop this recollection of the Buddha while you are walking, while you are standing, while you are sitting, while you are lying down, while you are busy at work, while you are resting in your home crowded with children. And that's one of the reasons why I really like this practice, because it kind of describes my life and probably like lots of people's life. Busy at work, you've got home crowded with children. A lot of the time you're going to be sitting down, or you're going to be standing, or you're going to be walking or lying down. It covers kind of most of the things we're going to be doing. Or basically what the Buddha's saying all the time, bear the Buddha in mind. Whatever you're doing, so you're at work, you're having a meeting, you're typing an email, bear the Buddha in mind. Or your house is filled with children like mine and they're arguing with each other and you're trying to get them ready for school, bear the Buddha in mind. He describes the benefits of that. And in a moment, I'll tell you what the Buddha says are the benefits of doing that in those situations, bearing the Buddha in mind. But I wanted to kind of just ask an important question. Why is this important to us? We're hearing about disciples of the Buddha who lived 2,500 years ago. They bore the Buddha in mind. What's it got to do with us in a way? That's an important question to ask, I think, all the time. And there's a really important answer. I think this is, you could say, one of the most important stories. I think one of the most important stories, because like a huge aspect of the Buddhist tradition emerges out of these stories and this practice. And the key point is that these people were separated from the Buddha. They couldn't be with the Buddha. They loved the Buddha, but they couldn't be with him. Mahanama couldn't be with the Buddha. Pingiya couldn't be with the Buddha. They were separated from the Buddha. Well, so are we. We are separated from the Buddha. They were separated by space. And we're separated by space, but we're also separated by time from the Buddha. We can't be around the Buddha. In just the same way Mahanama couldn't be around the Buddha, Pingiya couldn't be around the Buddha. Well, we can't be around the Buddha. But the good news is that, if you can cultivate a potent enough connection with the Buddha, if you can cultivate a heart response like Pingiya, like Mahanama, you can be in direct communication or communion with the Buddha. You can be in relationship with the Buddha. And the Buddha describes to Mahanama the benefits of doing this. He says, recollect the Buddha all the time when you're busy at work, when you're resting at home, when your house full of children, when you're lying down, when you're sitting down. And he says, Mahanama, when a disciple of the Buddha is recollecting the Buddha, their mind isn't overcome with passion, aversion, and delusion. So most of the time, our mind might be overcome with one of those: greed, hatred, delusion. When you're thinking about the Buddha, when you're recollecting the Buddha, your mind isn't overcome with craving, aversion, hatred, delusion. So that's a big benefit straight away. That's a good reason to do this practice, isn't it? And then he said, the disciple of the Buddha doing this practice, their mind heads straight based on the Buddha. So this is an aspect of mindfulness. You're choosing the direction you want your mind to go in. And if you bear the Buddha in mind, your mind will head straight based on the Buddha. And then the Buddha says, when the mind is headed straight, the disciple of the Noble One gains a sense of the goal, gains a sense of the Dharma, and gains joy connected with the Dharma. Well, that sounds great as well, doesn't it? You get a sense of the goal and a sense of the Dharma, but you get joy connected with the Dharma. So if you do this practice, your mind doesn't overcome with greed, hatred, and delusion. Your mind heads straight based on the Buddha. You've got a sense of the goal, a sense of the Dharma, and joy connected to the Dharma. And then the Buddha says even more, in someone whose mind is joyful, rapture arises. In one who is rapturous, the body grows calm. And in one whose body is calmed, experiences ease. And in one at ease, the mind becomes concentrated. So a spiral path starts to emerge from it, from joy, rapture, calm, ease, concentration. So it sounds like a good thing to do, doesn't it? To be bearing the Buddha in mind all the time. And this is really come back to what this Buddha's teaching. What you put your mind upon has consequences. That's what you'll become. So you can choose if you want to. You can put your mind on social media if you want to, and your mind will become full of greed, hatred, and delusion, scattered, diverse, not able to concentrate very easily, not able to focus. You could put your mind on the news, which is helpful some of the time, but if it's overwhelming, you're going to have a different result of that. You could put your mind on football. I do that too much. That has a consequence. There's lots of things you could put your mind on, but it's your choice. You choose what you put your mind on, and that's what you become. That's what the Buddha taught. So if you choose to put your mind on the Buddha, these are the benefits. So it's a really relevant practice to us. But I suppose there's a bit of a catch, which is that it was easy for Pingiya, maybe. It was easy for Mahanama because they knew the Buddha, they'd met him, they hung around him, so they could just close their eyes, think of the Buddha, and away they go, really. They've got that connection with the Buddha straight away. So we've got some work to do. We have work to do. We need to cultivate, and we can cultivate a heart connection with the Buddha. We can cultivate a sense of the Buddha, a relationship with the Buddha, so that when we bring the Buddha to mind, initially it might be quite weak, it might be quite dry, but over time we can flesh that out, we can fill that out, so the Buddha becomes more and more alive in our imagination, in our heart connection. We can cultivate this. And I just want to give some ways and some examples of how you can cultivate a connection to the Buddha, a heart response to the Buddha. So the first one is stories, and that's what this has been leading up to in a way. This series at Sangha Night has been leading up to this. We've heard lots and lots and lots of stories of the Buddha. And they've been told brilliantly, the people have told the stories brilliantly, really evoked the stories and empathized with the characters. If you do that, the stories come alive. If you tell the stories in a particular way, if you engage in the stories in a particular way, it's like you're there. Maybe, Padma talks about this, perhaps you're not like right centre, but maybe at the back of a crowd, like peering over, watching the Buddha and interacting with these people. The quality of your imagination, the quality of how you engage with these stories brings the Buddha alive, brings these interactions alive. And you can spend time reflecting on these stories, dwelling on these stories, telling these stories. And over time, these qualities of the Buddha emerge, and you get a sense of what the Buddha is like and what it might have been like to be around the Buddha. So when you bring the Buddha to mind in your Bodhinaga practice, you get a sense of the Buddha. You get a sense of being with the Buddha. And that's something I'd like you to dwell on in your groups shortly. Is of all the stories you've heard during these series, has there been a particular story that has really struck you or affected you, or you've been inspired by or moved by? Because that's something to dwell on and to reflect on, and you can bring that into your Bodhinaga practice that we'll be doing later. So stories is really, really important. And when you hear, I mean, you can hear, if you look up case of dysentery, this was a story that Ananta Kirti told last week. If you Google that on Free Buddhist Audio, look at Free Buddhist Audio, you hear Sangha telling that story. And the disciples of Sangha, I've heard Padmavajra talk about this, they say like when Sangha was ordained and practicing, there weren't really many Buddhist books about, there weren't many translations, but he spent lots and lots of time just reflecting on the stories of the Buddha, reflecting on the Buddha's life, reflecting on what little Dharma there was available. And it really came alive, the Dharma and the Buddha really came alive through that practice. And Padmavajra describes this as though he was introduced to the Buddha by Sangha. It's like Sangha knew the Buddha and was able to introduce Padmavajra to the Buddha. And when I've heard Padmavajra talk about the Buddha and tell stories about the Buddha, little qualities and little details emerge from these stories. And it's like, oh, Padmavajra knows the Buddha, and he's kind of introducing me to the Buddha when he's telling this story and this interaction of the Buddha. And we can do that. We can really dwell on these stories, reflect on these stories, bring them alive, and we get to know the Buddha through doing that. And we can introduce other people to the Buddha through doing that. So stories are really, really important. I want to talk about another way of cultivating this connection that's been really important for me, and that was going on pilgrimage in 2011. I was part of a group that went on the first pilgrimage from the Sheffield Buddhist Centre to where's it gone? Just use your imagination. This becomes India when you use your imagination, it's the same. So just here is the north of India. And we went to all of these places on pilgrimage. It was Maitridasa organised a pilgrimage with Mani Dharma in India. Mogavanksa was there. Other people will have been here have gone on subsequent pilgrimages. And we went to Lumbini, where the Buddha was born, Kusinara, where the Buddha died, Sarnath, where the Buddha gave his first teaching, and to Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha was enlightened. And it brings, when you've heard these stories and heard about the historical Buddha, I must admit it was a bit flat, it was a bit dry, it didn't mean that much to me, there wasn't so much resonance. But when you're physically standing in the place where Angulimala met the Buddha, or where the Buddha taught the mindfulness of breathing, or where the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and was enlightened, it comes alive in a particular way. If you can imagine that the story took place in Endcliffe Park and the Buddha met Mahanama by the cafe, you'd know quite a lot of information already. You'd know, oh, I know that cafe, I know what the bird song's like there and what the river's like. Suddenly the story comes alive. So I felt my connection with the Buddha really came alive by going on pilgrimage. And as it happens, there's a plan for a pilgrimage in 2028, in a couple of years' time, and people will be starting to talk about people who might be interested in going. So if you think that might be something you're interested in, Maitridasa again and Shan are going to plan to organise a pilgrimage in 2028, and I'd really, really recommend doing it. Really recommend it. But I want to talk about a particular experience. We went to Shravasti, and I don't know if all the pilgrimages go to Shravasti, but it's kind of off the beaten track, and it was a pain to get there. It's like hours and hours and hours on a minibus. Where are we going? That was the experience a lot of the time on pilgrimage, actually. It's like that. And where are we going to sleep? But then you get to these amazing places where the Buddha lived and taught. It's incredible. So we arrived in Shravasti, and there wasn't really many people there, and there wasn't much there. It was kind of off the tourist track. It was off the beaten track. And we arrived in a monastery. I think it might have been a Zen monastery, and that we were making too much noise. They didn't like us because we were kind of this kind of English bunch of like noisy Westerners. Well, I don't think they were just a bit too noisy. Anyway, but I sat down to meditate in their shrine room, and something like really, really weird happened. It was like, well, it wasn't like, it was like I was sitting down and I was meditating with the Buddha in the company of the Buddha, just without making any effort. Suddenly, it's like that Shravasti was where the Buddha had spent 30 years, all the 30 rainy seasons, a lot of time the Buddha spent in Shravasti. And you could feel it. It was like there was resonances of the Buddha's mind still there, of the enlightened mind, of even like all those years had passed and it was still resonating with the Buddha's mind. That was my experience of it. Shravasti was a really special place for me. And I can understand why Pingiya described the Buddha as a world or a universe. It's like it wasn't just the Buddha's physical body that was important. like the Buddha. And when we had Parinirvana Day, we heard that when the Buddha died, he wouldn't really say what happens to a Buddha's consciousness after death. It wasn't something he could put into words and concepts. But my experience in Shravasti was that the Buddha was there. That you could that was my experience. So pilgrimage stories I've talked about, and then just to name other ways, mantra. We chant mantras, and there's a mantra of Shakyamuni Buddha. That is a way of bringing the Buddha into your mind through those sacred syllables, through the mantra. A really good image of the Buddha can bring to mind what the Buddha might have been like. And we do this on the follow-on course, don't we, on the intermediate course, where we look at an Arloka painting of the Buddha. And it's amazing each time people really get a sense of the groundedness of the Buddha's body, the spaciousness of his mind, the vastness of his mind. His hands seem really kind of practical and kind and pragmatic. So a really good image can convey and communicate what the Buddha might have been like. And ritual, performing puja and ritual is another way of creating the conditions to bring about a connection with the enlightened mind. Okay. So two disciples, Mahanama, Pingiya, doing the same practice, the Bodhinaga practice. Just going to quickly show you my other list before I finish. This was Pingiya's heart conditions. And as I thought, it's a nice way to describe it. Usually we talk about heart conditioning, we think of angina, don't we? Or we think of like an arrhythmia. But these are the conditions that Pingiya created in his own heart to have that really powerful, potent connection with the Buddha. He described confidence, faith in the Buddha, Shraddha, joy, intellect. I don't know what that's a translation of. I want to look that up. Awareness, which will be mindfulness, and purposeful thought. So these are the conditions that Pingiya, that's the way he practiced his mindfulness of the Buddha, his recollection of the Buddha, to give it that real potency. So that's another list to bear in mind. So we've heard about the practice, we've heard about the Buddha, the way that the Buddha described the practice to Mahanama. We've heard about the benefits of the practice, that your mind will head straight, you'll get a sense of joy, you'll get a sense of the Buddha and the Dharma. But it goes further than that, because at the end of the story with Pingiya, you get a sense of Pingiya's connection to the Buddha, because even though the Pingiya's now down here somewhere with his old teacher Bharvari, the Buddha speaks to him. I don't know if Bharvari hears this as well, if it's just in Pingiya's mind, but the Buddha speaks to Pingiya. And he says to Pingiya, Pingiya, other people have freed themselves by the power of confidence. Vakali, Bhadravuddha, Alavi Gautama have all done this. You too should let that strength release you. You too will go to the further shore, beyond the jaw of death. So the Buddha speaks to Pingiya and says, other people have become enlightened, they've become liberated, released through this practice. It's not just a practice that gives you joy and makes you calm and keeps your mind free of greed, hatred, and delusion. People have become released, enlightened, liberated through this practice. And he says, you too should let that strength release you. You too can go to the further shore. So I just end by by reading out Pingiya's response to the Buddha. And in a way, Pingiya's release, his own liberation. So when Pingiya hears his words, his mind is without doubts, and he becomes liberated. So Pingiya says to the replies, these words are the words of a man of wisdom. As I hear them, I become more confident. This man is Sambuddha. He has opened the curtains and woken up. I love that description of the Buddha. He's opened the curtains and woken up. He's not just awake. He's opened the curtains and woken up. Mm-hmm. There's nothing barren there. His mind is clear and luminous. Everything accessible to knowledge is known to him, even the ultimate subtleties of Godhood. There are no more questions for the doubtful who come to him. The teacher has answered them all. Yes, I shall go there. I shall go beyond change. I shall go beyond formations. I shall go beyond comparison. There are no more doubts. You may consider this as mind released. So I think that's a fitting place to end the talk. Pingiya, through this practice, through his confidence, is liberated, and he says, you may consider this as mind released. Thank you.